September 1944. A Japanese army nurse stands in a Texas prison camp dining hall, staring at 6 strips of bacon on her breakfast plate. She has not eaten meat in 3 years. Her mother back in Hiroshima is boiling tree bark for soup, and she is about to do something that will haunt her for the rest of her life. She is going to eat enemy food, and when she does, everything she believes about America, about Japan, about this war, will shatter like glass. But that moment is still 24 hours away. First, we must go back to a military transport ship cutting through the morning fog of San Francisco Bay, back to the moment when 2 people from opposite sides of the world were about to collide. The fog rolled thick across the water on September 15th. Sergeant James Coleman stood on the Oakland dock, clipboard in hand, watching the gray shape of the transport vessel emerge from the mist like a ghost ship materializing from another world. At 28 years old, Jim stood 6'2", broad-shouldered, from a lifetime of ranch work in the Texas Panhandle. His uniform was pressed sharp boots polished to a mirror shine, but his hands told the real story. These were working hands, calloused from barbed wire and cattle ropes, hands that had built fences across 2,000 acres of Coleman family land, hands that knew the weight of work. He had volunteered for this assignment, escorting Japanese prisoners of war from the California coast to Crystal City internment camp. Most of the other military police at Fort Sam Houston had turned down the duty. Nobody wanted to babysit enemy prisoners when real combat was happening in Europe and the Pacific. But Jim had reasons, personal reasons that burned like coal in his chest every time he thought about Pearl Harbor, about his best friend, Johnny Martinez, who went down with the USS Arizona, about the newspaper photographs of American nurses captured in the Philippines, their faces hollow with starvation. Today, Jim thought he would finally look the enemy in the eye. The transport ship's horn bellowed across the water. Deckhands rushed to secure the mooring lines. Jim straightened his shoulders and moved toward the gangplank, flanked by 2 other military policemen. Corporal Rodriguez on his left, Private Chen on his right. Both good men, both wondering like Jim what kind of fanatics they were about to encounter. The ship's cargo hold door opened with a metallic screech, and 47 Japanese women emerged into American sunlight for the first time. Sachiko Tanaka was the 14th woman down the gangplank. At 23 years old, she weighed 98 pounds. Her Imperial Japanese Army nursing uniform, once crisp and proper, hung loose on her frame like a shroud. 3 years of war had carved away everything soft from her body. Her cheekbones stood sharp beneath skin stretched tight. Her wrists were bird bones wrapped in flesh. But her eyes, those dark eyes, they still burned with something fierce. Pride, maybe. Or terror masquerading as courage. She had expected demons. The American propaganda her military commanders had shown before Saipan fell had promised barbaric monsters. Soldiers with savage faces who tortured prisoners and desecrated the dead. The training films depicted Americans as primitive, cruel, technologically backward. A nation of farmers and factory workers who could barely feed themselves, let alone wage a modern war. Instead, this tall guard at the bottom of the gangplank had kind eyes. He offered his hand to help her down the steep metal steps. Sachiko did not take it. Accepting enemy kindness felt like betrayal, like admitting defeat before the war was even over. She gripped the cold railing and descended on her own, her legs shaking from weeks aboard the transport ship. But when she stumbled on the last step, those strong hands caught her anyway. Gentle hands, careful hands, hands that steadied her without gripping too tight. Jim Coleman felt the woman's weight barely 90 pounds, and something in his chest twisted. This was the enemy, this terrified girl who flinched at his touch. He had psyched himself up for fanatics, for the monsters from the newsreels. Instead, he was catching a starving woman who looked like she might blow away in the bay breeze. Her eyes met his for one electric second. Fear. That is what Jim saw. Pure animal fear. Not hatred, not fanaticism, just the primal terror of a prisoner who expected torture and was trying desperately not to show it. Something in that moment cracked open inside Jim Coleman. Some wall he had been building since Pearl Harbor. But he pushed it down, locked it away, and stepped back to professional distance. "This way, ma'am," he said, gesturing toward the military buses waiting on the dock. Sachiko did not understand the English words, but she understood the gesture. She moved toward the bus with the other women, all of them silent, all of them scanning for the cruelty they had been promised was coming. But the cruelty did not come. Instead, they saw electric street lights lining the Oakland dock. Tall metal poles crowned with glass bulbs that would illuminate the darkness when night fell. Sachiko had only seen electric streetlights in downtown Hiroshima, and even there they were shut off most nights to conserve power for the war effort. Here in an enemy country at war, electric lights stood ready to burn all night. The buses themselves were another shock. Large vehicles with cushioned seats and glass windows. Not the military trucks with wooden benches Sachiko had expected. As she climbed aboard, she noticed the seats were clean. The floor was swept. There were no chains, no cages, just rows of seats facing forward like a public bus in peacetime Japan. The other women whispered among themselves in Japanese as they settled into seats. Reiko Yamamoto, a 32-year-old teacher from Tokyo, sat beside Sachiko and gripped her hand. "This does not match what we were told," Reiko whispered. Sachiko nodded, unable to speak, because through the bus window as they pulled away from the dock, she could see San Francisco proper. And nothing, absolutely nothing, matched what she had been told. Buildings rose 10 stories, 12 stories, 15 stories into the sky. Concrete and steel towers that made Tokyo's tallest structures look modest. The streets were paved smooth with asphalt marked with painted lines, orderly and geometric. Cars filled every avenue. Not military vehicles, but private automobiles owned by ordinary citizens. Sachiko counted 12 cars in one intersection alone. In Hiroshima, her father's government office had owned 2 automobiles for the entire department. And the people. American civilians walking the sidewalks in the middle of a war. They looked healthy, well-fed. The women wore colorful dresses made from fabrics that would have been considered luxury items in Japan. They carried leather handbags. They wore makeup and jewelry. One woman was laughing, actually laughing, as she walked with a young child who was eating something from a paper wrapper. Sachiko pressed her face to the window, unable to look away. Jim Coleman, sitting in the front seat of the bus, watched the prisoners' reactions in the rearview mirror. He had seen this before with German POWs with Italian internees, the shock of American normalcy. But watching these Japanese women who had been fed such complete lies about American poverty, the shock seemed deeper somehow, almost painful. The convoy of 3 buses rolled through downtown San Francisco, and Jim made a decision. He leaned forward and spoke to the driver. "Take Market Street," he said, "then cut through the financial district." The driver glanced back, surprised. "That is the long way to the train station, Sarge." "I know," Jim said. "Take it anyway." So the buses turned onto Market Street, the wide boulevard that showcased American commercial prosperity. Department stores with window displays full of goods. Restaurants with signs advertising steaks and seafood. Movie theaters with marquees announcing the latest films. And everywhere, electric signs powered by a grid that never seemed to shut down. Sachiko's training as a nurse had taught her to observe carefully, to document details, to analyze evidence. So she observed. She documented in her mind. She analyzed. And slowly, terribly, she began to understand. If this was American poverty, what did that make Japan? The bus ride from Oakland to the San Francisco train station took 40 minutes. 40 minutes of cognitive dissonance so intense that Sachiko felt physically ill. Every block contradicted another piece of propaganda. Every storefront demolished another lie. By the time they arrived at the Southern Pacific Railroad depot, Sachiko's entire understanding of the war had begun to fracture. The train itself was the final blow to her remaining certainty. A passenger train, not a prison transport. The cars had cushioned bench seats facing each other across small tables. Windows that opened to let in fresh air. A dining car where she was told through a translator meals would be served during the 3-day journey to Texas. 3 days. California to Texas. Sachiko had studied American geography during her nursing education. She knew how vast this country was. Larger than Japan. Much larger. But knowing it intellectually and experiencing it physically were different things entirely. As the train pulled out of San Francisco Station at 3 that afternoon, Sachiko settled into a window seat and prepared herself for a journey that would teach her more truth than she was ready to accept. Jim Coleman moved through the train car, checking on the prisoners. His orders were clear. Treat them according to the Geneva Convention. Provide food, water, medical care as needed. Maintain security, but avoid unnecessary cruelty. He took those orders seriously, not because he liked the Japanese, but because he was a Coleman. And Colemans did things right or not at all. His father had taught him that. Ben Coleman, who had built the family ranch from nothing, who had survived the Depression without losing a single acre, who had raised 3 sons to believe that a man's character showed in how he treated those who could not fight back. Ben Coleman had died in the spring of 1943, leaving Jim to run the ranch alone until his draft number came up. By the time Jim was cleared to enlist, the Army did not want him in combat. They wanted him in military police, managing the flood of prisoners that were starting to arrive from both theaters of war. Jim had felt ashamed at first. His 2 older brothers were fighting in Europe with the Marines. Real combat, real glory, and here was Jim escorting prisoners and guarding camps. Consolation prize duty for men who could not cut it on the front lines. But then he remembered what his father had said the night before he died. They had been sitting on the ranch house porch watching the sunset over the flat Texas plains. Ben had put his weathered hand on Jim's shoulder. Son Ben had said, his voice weak from the cancer eating his lungs. War brings out the worst in men. Killing is easy when you are scared and angry. But mercy, Jim, mercy when you have every right to be cruel. That is what separates civilized men from savages. You remember that whatever this war brings. So Jim walked through the train car distributing canteens of water to women who flinched when he approached. And he tried to see them the way his father would have wanted, not as enemies, just as people, scared, hungry, far from home people. The California landscape rolled past the windows as afternoon turned to evening. Farm country first, the vast agricultural valley that fed much of America. Sachiko watched fields stretch to the horizon, each one larger than entire villages in Japan. She saw tractors, combines, mechanical harvesters, machines she had never imagined existed. In Japan, farming was done by hand, by families bent over rice paddies, by water buffalo pulling wooden plows. Here, one farmer, with one machine, could harvest more grain than 100 Japanese farmers working all season. The industrial capacity required to build such machines, Sachiko thought, the fuel to run them, the infrastructure to maintain them. This was not the primitive resource poor America of Japanese propaganda. This was something else entirely. As darkness fell, the electric lights inside the train car came on automatically. Bright, clean light that did not flicker or dim. Sachiko had worked in a military hospital that relied on candles and oil lamps for night operations because electricity was too precious to waste on medical care. Here on a prisoner transport train, lights burned without a second thought. At 6:30 in the evening, the dining car opened for dinner service. Jim and the other MPS escorted the Japanese women to the dining car in groups of 10. Sachiko was in the third group. She walked through the narrow corridor between cars, feeling the rhythmic sway of the train, and entered a space that looked like a restaurant. Tables covered with clean white cloths, proper plates and silverware, windows framing the darkening landscape, and American soldiers serving food from large metal pans, ladling portions onto each prisoner's plate with the same care they would show their own families. The meal was roast beef sandwiches, potato chips, apples, cookies, and milk. Sachiko stared at her plate. The sandwich alone contained more meat than her family had eaten in a month. Thick slices of beef on soft white bread. The bread itself a luxury. Potato chips crispy and salted. A snack food that had not existed in Japan since before the war. An apple fresh and unblemished, probably from California orchards. Cookies sweet and crumbly. And milk. Cold milk in a glass bottle with condensation dripping down the sides. This was not prison rations. This was abundance. Around her, the other Japanese women sat frozen, staring at their food like it might be poisoned or fake. Jim noticed the hesitation. He had expected this. The Germans and Italians had been suspicious too at first. But he had learned that actions spoke louder than words. He picked up his own identical meal, took a large bite of his roast beef sandwich, and chewed slowly, making sure every prisoner could see him eating the same food. "It is not poison, ladies," he said, knowing most would not understand his English, but hoping his actions would translate. Still, they did not eat. Sachiko understood more English than the others, thanks to her medical training. She had studied from American nursing textbooks smuggled into Japan before the war, but understanding the words and accepting the reality were different things. To eat this food meant accepting enemy charity. It meant admitting dependence on captors. It meant in some fundamental way choosing survival over honor. The other women looked to her. Sachiko was the youngest, but she had education status as a nurse and some ability to communicate with the guards. They waited to see what she would do. Sachiko looked down at the roast beef sandwich. She looked at Jim Coleman, who had returned to his own meal, not forcing the issue, but not backing down either. She looked at Reiko, whose eyes were filled with tears because the smell of food was so overwhelming after weeks of near starvation on the transport ship. And Sachiko made a choice. She picked up the sandwich and took the smallest possible bite. The taste exploded across her tongue. Salt, fat, protein flavors that her body recognized as life itself. Her stomach cramped violently, unused to real food. But she chewed. She swallowed. And in that moment, something inside her began to shift. Around her, the other women began to eat. Slowly at first, almost guiltily. Then faster as hunger overcame shame. Jim watched them eat and felt that crack in his chest widen a little more. These were not monsters. These were hungry women eating their first real meal in months, maybe years. What kind of government, he wondered, sends its people to war against a nation they cannot possibly defeat and lies to them about it? After dinner, the women returned to their passenger car. Some fell asleep immediately exhausted by food and emotion. Others sat awake staring out windows at the American darkness rushing past. Sachiko could not sleep. Her mind raced with calculations, comparisons, questions that had no comfortable answers. She pulled a small notebook from her pocket. It had been a gift from her mother before Sachiko left for nursing school, before the war, before everything changed. The first half was filled with medical notes, patient observations, treatment protocols. The back half was blank. Sachiko began to write in Japanese in tiny characters to conserve paper. She documented everything she had seen since arriving in America. The electric lights, the buildings, the katsubus, the gentle hands that had caught her when she stumbled. If she survived this, someone needed to know the truth. The train rolled on through the night, carrying 47 Japanese women deeper into enemy territory, deeper into a reality that contradicted everything they had been taught to believe. In the front of the car, Jim Coleman sat awake too, writing his own letter by the light of a reading lamp. Dear Thomas, he wrote to his brother somewhere in Europe. I am escorting Japanese POWs to Texas, women mostly, nurses and civilian workers. Tom, you would hate me saying this, but they do not look like monsters. They look scared and hungry. Jim paused, pen hovering over paper. Part of me wants to make them suffer for what they did at Pearl Harbor, for what they did to Johnny. But I keep thinking about what Dad used to say. A man's character shows in how he treats those who cannot fight back. These women cannot fight back. They are prisoners. Does that make me weak, Tom? Am I dishonoring Johnny's memory by not hating them enough? I do not know anymore. See you when this war is over. Your brother Jim. He folded the letter knowing it would not be mailed until they reached Crystal City, knowing his brother probably would not understand. Hell, Jim barely understood himself. But something had changed in those first 12 hours. Something about catching a starving woman on a gangplank. Something about watching her cry while eating roast beef. Something about looking into enemy eyes and seeing fear instead of hatred. The train carried them all eastward through the California night, toward Texas, toward Crystal City, toward a confrontation with truth that would change them in ways neither Jim Coleman nor Sachiko Tanaka could yet imagine. Day 2 of the train journey began at dawn somewhere in Nevada. Sachiko woke to find the landscape had changed completely. Desert now, vast and empty, stretching to mountains that looked like waves frozen in stone. She had never seen terrain like this. Japan was green, lush, crowded. This American emptiness was almost frightening in its scale. Breakfast was served at 7:30. Scrambled eggs, bacon, toast, orange juice, coffee. The bacon. 6 strips on her plate, thick cut crispy on the edges, fat glistening with salt and smoke. Sachiko stared at it, knowing that her first taste of pork in 3 years would be a line she could never uncross. By mid-morning, the train was crossing into Utah. Jim came through the car with a translator, a Japanese-American soldier named Private Watanabe, explaining the route they would take. California to Nevada, to Utah, to Colorado, to New Mexico, to Texas. 3 days covering more than 2,000 miles. Sachiko listened and tried to comprehend a nation so vast that a 3-day train journey barely crossed it. Around noon, something happened that would crack Jim Coleman's worldview even wider. An elderly Japanese woman named Fumiko Sato, 58 years old, collapsed in her seat. One moment she was looking out the window. The next she was unconscious, her breathing shallow and rapid. The women around her cried out in Japanese panic, spreading through the car. Sachiko's nurse training kicked in instantly. She rushed to the woman's side, checking pulse, breathing, skin color. The symptoms were clear: severe dehydration, malnutrition, possible heat exhaustion from the desert sun streaming through the windows. Help, Sachiko called out in English, her accent thick, but the word clear. Please, she need water. Medicine. Jim was in the next car when he heard the commotion. He ran back, pushing through the crowded aisle, and found Sachiko kneeling beside the unconscious woman. What happened? He demanded. She collapsed. No water enough, no food enough. She need doctor. Jim did not hesitate. He grabbed the emergency medical kit, bolted to the wall, yanked out blankets, water, a first aid manual. He dropped to his knees beside Sachiko. Tell me what to do. And just like that, enemy became ally. Jim followed Sachiko's instructions, holding the woman's head, while Sachiko slowly dripped water between her lips. They worked together, nurse and soldier, their hands touching as they turned the woman on her side, checked her breathing, monitored her pulse. Jim radioed ahead to the next station. Albuquerque, New Mexico. They would have a doctor waiting. For 20 minutes, they worked to keep Fumiko Sato alive. And in those 20 minutes, everything Jim thought he knew about the enemy dissolved. This Japanese nurse was good at her job, competent, caring. She spoke to the unconscious woman in soothing Japanese, even though the woman could not hear. She checked vitals with practiced efficiency. She knew exactly what needed to be done, and she did it without hesitation. This was not a fanatic. This was a professional doing her duty. When the train pulled into Albuquerque Station, 90 minutes later, an army doctor was waiting. He boarded, examined Fumiko Sato, and immediately started an IV drip. Fluids, vitamins, medication. She is severely malnourished, the doctor said, looking at Jim with accusation in his eyes. How long has she been in your custody? 2 days, Jim said. She was like this when we picked her up in Oakland. The doctor's expression softened. Then this is pre-existing. Probably been starving for months before capture. He looked at Sachiko. You did good work keeping her alive. Are you a nurse? Sachiko understood enough to nod. Well, nurse, the doctor said through Private Watanabe's translation, you saved this woman's life today. After the doctor left, after Fumiko was stabilized and sleeping peacefully, with the IV drip feeding life back into her veins, Jim and Sachiko stood together in the narrow space between train cars. The desert landscape rushed past. The late afternoon sun turned everything gold. You did good work, Jim said. You are a real nurse, Sachiko understood. She nodded, tired but proud. You helped. Why, she is enemy. She is a sick old lady, Jim said. That is all that matters right now. Their eyes met, really met, for the second time since the Oakland dock. And in that moment, both of them felt their certainties crack a little wider. For Sachiko, the crack revealed this truth. Americans might not be demons after all. For Jim, the crack revealed this Japanese might not all be monsters. It was a small crack. But in 2 days, it would become a chasm. The Texas landscape announced itself before the train even crossed the border. The mountains of New Mexico gave way to flatness so absolute it seemed like the earth had been pressed smooth by God's own hand. Mesquite trees dotted the horizon, their twisted branches reaching toward a sky so blue it hurt to look at. The air that blew through the open train windows carried the smell of dust and cattle, and something else Sachiko could not name. Something that felt like space itself. Day 3, September 18th, 1944. The train had traveled through the night, rocking and swaying, carrying its cargo of 47 Japanese women deeper into the heart of enemy territory. Sachiko had barely slept, her mind too full of contradictions, her body too aware that with every mile they were moving farther from any possibility of rescue or escape. Not that escape seemed necessary anymore. That was perhaps the most disturbing realization of all. The train pulled into Crystal City Station at 11:30 in the morning. The small Texas town shimmered in the September heat, its main street lined with businesses that looked prosperous despite the war. A hardware store, a grocery, a movie theater with a marquee advertising a film Sachiko had never heard of. American flags hung from several storefronts, stirring in the hot breeze. But it was the internment camp itself, visible beyond the town's edge, that stopped Sachiko's breath. White cottages arranged in neat rows. Tree-lined streets with names she could see painted on posts. Children playing, actually playing, in a central square. A baseball field with a real backstop and bases. Gardens with vegetables growing in organized plots. And everywhere, a sense of normalcy that made no sense for a prison. The women pressed against the train windows, murmuring in Japanese, their voices rising with confusion and disbelief. This cannot be the prison, Reiko whispered. It must be a temporary facility, another woman said. The real prison must be elsewhere. But Jim Coleman, overhearing their confusion through Private Watanabe's translation, shook his head. This is it, ladies. Welcome to Crystal City. They disembarked onto a platform where 3 military buses waited. But first, an official greeting. Major William Bradford, camp commander, stood in his crisp uniform, flanked by administrative staff and translators. At 52, Bradford had the bearing of a career military man who had seen one world war and refused to let the second one strip away his humanity. He waited until all 47 women were assembled on the platform, standing in the Texas sun, wilting in the heat, before he spoke. Ladies, Bradford began, his voice carrying authority, but not cruelty. Welcome to Crystal City Internment Facility. You will be housed in family cottages, 4 women per unit. You will receive 3 meals daily, medical care, educational opportunities, and access to recreation facilities. The Japanese women listened with expressions ranging from suspicion to bewilderment. Where are the cells? One of the older women asked through the translator. Where is the real prison? Bradford's expression did not change. This is the prison, ma'am. We do not use cells for non-combatant internees. You will live in cottages with basic amenities. Your freedom of movement will be restricted to the camp boundaries, but within those boundaries you may move freely. The answer satisfied no one because it made no sense. Prisons had bars and chains and punishment cells. This place had cottages and trees and children playing. The buses took them deeper into the camp. Sachiko sat by a window, her medical training pushing her to observe and document, even as her emotions threatened to overwhelm her. The cottages were simple wood frame structures, painted white, each with a small front porch. They looked like something from an American neighborhood, not a prison camp. After medical processing came housing assignments. Jim had been assigned to escort the group that included Sachiko to their cottage. Cottage number 23 in the Japanese section, shaded by a large mesquite tree. He carried the key and a clipboard listing the 4 women who would share the space. Sachiko Tanaka, Reiko Yamamoto, Yuki Nakamura, a 21-year-old communications clerk, and Hana Fujimoto, a 34-year-old teacher. The 4 women stood on the porch while Jim unlocked the front door. None of them knew what to expect. Prison cells, surely. Concrete floors and metal bunks and a bucket for a toilet. Jim pushed the door open and stepped aside. After you, ladies. They entered slowly, defensively, waiting for the trap. Instead, they found a home. The living room held a sofa, worn but clean, its cushions faded from sun, but still intact. 2 armchairs flanked a small coffee table. A radio, an actual radio, sat on a shelf built into the wall. Windows with glass panes and curtains let in the Texas sunlight. An electric lamp stood on a side table, its cord running to an outlet in the wall. Sachiko walked to the lamp and flipped the switch. Light flooded the room. She flipped it off, then on again. Off, on. Electric power at the flip of a switch. In Japan, even in Hiroshima's city center, electricity was rationed, shut off for hours each day to conserve fuel for the war effort. Here in a prison camp for enemies, power flowed continuously, endlessly, at the whim of anyone who wanted light. Reiko moved toward the kitchen like a woman in a dream. The small room held an electric stove with 4 burners, a sink with a faucet that promised running water, and against the far wall, humming softly, a refrigerator. She opened the refrigerator door. Cold air spilled out. The interior light came on automatically. Inside were basic supplies, milk, eggs, butter, vegetables. Not much, but more than most Japanese families had seen in months. Reiko closed the door, opened it again, touched the cold metal shelves, felt the mechanical hum through her fingertips. This cannot be real, she whispered in Japanese. Yuki, the youngest, had found the bedrooms. 2 rooms each with 2 beds. Real beds with mattresses and pillows and clean sheets. Dressers for clothing. Closets with wooden hangers. Windows with screens to keep out insects. And Hana, the eldest, had discovered the bathroom. She stood in the doorway, staring, unable to process what she was seeing. A flush toilet, white porcelain connected to plumbing, a bathtub with a shower head, hot and cold water taps, a sink with a mirror, towels hanging on a rack, indoor plumbing in a prison cottage for enemies. Jim stood in the living room, watching their reactions, feeling that crack in his chest widen into something close to pain. He had been here 6 months. He had seen this moment dozens of times with German and Italian internees. But it never got easier. Watching people realize that their own governments had lied to them about everything was like watching someone's faith die in real time. Everything works, he said quietly to Sachiko, who had circled back to the living room. The electricity, the water, the stove, it is all functional. Meals are served in the community dining hall at 7, noon, and 6. But you can cook here too if you want. Questions? Sachiko opened her mouth, closed it. Too many questions and none that she could articulate in English. Finally, she managed, "This is for us, 4 prisoners. Yes, ma'am. This is your housing for the duration of your internment." Sachiko turned away, unable to meet his eyes. Because if she looked at him, she would have to acknowledge what this meant. She would have to face the truth that was crystallizing in her mind with brutal clarity. Her family's home in Hiroshima had never had indoor plumbing. They used a communal well for water and an outhouse for sanitation. Her father, a government bureaucrat, was considered middle class, comfortable by Japanese standards. They had electricity in 2 rooms, shut off after 9 each night. They had never owned a refrigerator. Ice was delivered in blocks by a vendor who came twice a week in summer. And here in an American prison camp, she had all of it. Running hot water, electricity without limits, a refrigerator that ran day and night, a flush toilet. Either American wealth was so vast that even prisoners lived like Japanese elites, or everything Japan had taught her about American poverty was a lie. She knew which answer was true. She had known since San Francisco. But accepting it meant accepting that Japan had sent its people to die in a war against a nation so far ahead, technologically and economically, that defeat had been inevitable from the start. Jim left before Sachiko could formulate a response, closing the door softly behind him. The 4 women stood in their impossible cottage and tried to understand what this place meant. Reiko broke the silence first. "I need to test the water." She went to the kitchen sink and turned both taps. Water flowed instantly. The hot tap produced hot water within seconds. Steaming, clean hot water that ran and ran and ran without stopping. Reiko began to cry. Yuki tested the toilet, flushing it 3 times in succession, watching fresh water fill the bowl each time. Hana sat on the sofa and pressed her face into her hands. And Sachiko returned to the refrigerator, opened it, stared at the milk bottle. Fresh milk in glass, cold, available whenever they wanted it. Her mother's last letter received before the Saipan evacuation had mentioned that milk was no longer available in Hiroshima. The cows had been slaughtered for meat as food shortages worsened. Children were growing up without ever tasting milk. And here it sat in a refrigerator in a prison cottage for enemies who were supposed to be suffering. That night, Sachiko could not sleep. She lay in her bed in the shared bedroom, listening to Reiko's quiet breathing from the other bed. The mattress was soft. The pillow was real cotton, not stuffed with straw or rice husks. The sheet was clean and crisp. She had never been more comfortable in her life. She had never felt more ashamed. Around 3 a.m, she gave up on sleep and moved to the living room. She sat on the sofa in darkness, not wanting to turn on the electric light, not ready to accept that level of casual luxury. But through the window, she could see street lights burning all night long, illuminating the pathways between cottages. Bright and steady and utterly wasteful by Japanese standards. Except it was not wasteful here. It was normal. Sachiko pulled out her notebook and began to write by the ambient light from the street lamps. She wrote in Japanese, her characters small and precise, documenting everything. The cottage, the appliances, the plumbing, the electricity, the implications. She wrote, if America has this much excess that even prisons are electrified and supplied with running water and refrigeration, then Japan never had a chance. We were fighting a nation so wealthy, so industrially advanced, that they can afford to treat enemies better than we treat our own citizens. She wrote, our government knew this. They had to know. You cannot plan a war against another nation without understanding their capacity, which means they sent us to fight knowing we would lose. They lied to us about American weakness because the truth would have prevented the war. She wrote, I have been complicit in my own deception. I believe because believing was easier than questioning. I am ashamed. And then in English practice carefully, she wrote 4 more words, I cannot go back. Because how could she return to Hiroshima, to her family, to her country, and pretend she had not seen the truth? How could she eat rice porridge and be grateful when she had eaten roast beef? How could she use an outhouse when she had experienced the dignity of indoor plumbing? The truth had poisoned her, made her unfit for the lies that held Japanese society together. She sat there as dawn began to break over Crystal City, Texas, watching the streetlights finally shut off as sunlight took their place. Tomorrow would bring breakfast in the dining hall. Tomorrow would bring 6 strips of bacon on her plate. Tomorrow would bring the moment when her certainty would shatter completely. But for now, she held her notebook and understood that she had crossed a threshold from which there was no return. She had become the most dangerous kind of person in wartime, someone who knew the truth and could no longer pretend otherwise. The morning of September 19th, 1944 began at 6:30 when the community dining hall opened for breakfast. Jim Coleman had been assigned to help with the first meal service, partly to maintain security, partly to help the new internees navigate the system. He stood near the entrance as the Japanese women filed in, most of them moving slowly, uncertain, still adjusting to the camp's rhythms after their first night in the impossible cottages. The dining hall was large, designed to feed hundreds at once. Long tables arranged in rows. A serving line where staff ladled food onto trays. Windows along one wall letting in the early morning light. And the smell. God, the smell of American breakfast cooking. Bacon, eggs, coffee, toast. Sachiko entered the hall and that smell hit her like a physical force. Her stomach still adjusting to regular food after months of near starvation, cramped with immediate hunger. Around her, the other women were having similar reactions. Hana actually swayed on her feet, gripping the back of a chair to steady herself. They moved through the serving line like prisoners approaching execution, which in a way they were. This would be the execution of the last vestiges of their resistance. An older American woman, a civilian volunteer named Mrs. Patterson, worked the serving line. She had kind eyes and efficient hands, and she treated every internee, whether German, Italian, or Japanese, with the same matter-of-fact courtesy. She placed food on Sachiko's tray, without comment, without judgment. Just steady portions of standard American breakfast. 6 strips of bacon, thick cut the edges crispy and dark. The fat translucent and glistening, still hot from the griddle. The smell rising in waves that made Sachiko's mouth water involuntarily. 3 scrambled eggs. Fluffy yellow gold from real yolks, butter mixed in steam, rising seasoned with salt and pepper. 2 pieces of toast. White bread buttered, golden brown from the toaster. Hash brown potatoes. Shredded and fried crispy on the outside, tender inside seasoned. A glass of orange juice. Fresh squeezed pulp, visible bright orange and cold. A cup of coffee. Hot real coffee, not the barley tea substitute that had replaced it in Japan. Black unless she wanted cream and sugar, which were available at the end of the line. Sachiko carried her tray to a table where Reiko and the others from Cottage 23 were sitting. She set it down carefully as if the food might explode. This meal, this single breakfast, represented more calories and nutrition than Sachiko's family in Hiroshima had consumed in a week, maybe longer. Her mother was boiling tree bark. Her father was eating sawdust mixed with rice rations. Her grandmother, she would learn later, had already died of starvation 2 months before. And Sachiko was looking at bacon. The other women at the table were frozen too, staring at abundance, confronting the final undeniable proof of everything they had been trying not to accept. Jim Coleman walked past their table, not stopping, not staring, just maintaining presence. But he glanced at Sachiko as he passed. Their eyes met for half a second. In that moment, something passed between them. An acknowledgement, a shared understanding that what was about to happen was more than just eating breakfast. Sachiko picked up a strip of bacon. The texture registered first. Crispy outside, but tender inside. The fat soft and rich. Then the smell as she brought it close to her face. Salt, smoke, pork. Richness her body recognized as life itself. She bit down. The taste explosion was almost violent. Salt hit first, then fat, then the complex smoky flavor that comes from proper curing and cooking. The texture, the crunch giving way to tenderness. The way the fat melted across her tongue, her eyes filled with tears. Not from joy, not from gratitude. From the complete and total destruction of everything she had believed about the world. Around her, the other women began to eat too. Some quickly as if speed would make it less shameful. Others slowly savoring despite themselves. All of them crying or trying not to cry. Reiko ate 3 pieces of bacon before she had to stop. She put down her fork and covered her face with her hands. "We are eating better as prisoners than our families are eating as free citizens," she whispered in Japanese. Yuki nodded, unable to speak, tears running down her face. Hana pushed her plate away, unable to continue, unable to reconcile the richness of this food with the knowledge that her own children in Tokyo were subsisting on rice balls mixed with sawdust. But Sachiko kept eating, slowly, deliberately, forcing herself to taste every bite, to acknowledge every flavor, to feel the full weight of this truth. She ate all 6 strips of bacon. She ate the eggs and the toast and the potatoes. She drank the orange juice and the coffee. She consumed every calorie on that tray. And with each bite, she felt something inside her break and reform, until what remained was no longer the patriotic Japanese nurse who had volunteered to serve the emperor. What remained was someone who had seen behind the curtain, who knew the truth, who could never again accept comfortable lies. Jim watched from across the dining hall. He saw the moment it happened, the moment Sachiko Tanaka stopped being an enemy and became something else entirely. A witness, a survivor. Someone who would carry this knowledge like a scar for the rest of her life. After breakfast, Major Bradford made an announcement. The camp hospital needed help. An outbreak of influenza among the newly arrived Japanese internees had overwhelmed the medical staff. Weakened immune systems from months of malnutrition made the women vulnerable to infections that would have been minor inconveniences for healthy people. Dr. Margaret Chen, the camp's medical director, needed someone who spoke Japanese and understood medical protocols. She needed Sachiko Tanaka. The request came through official channels. Bradford approved it. And Jim Coleman, without asking for the assignment, was designated as Sachiko's security escort during her hospital duties. It was standard procedure. No prisoner worked outside their living quarters without IMA supervision. That was the official reason. The truth, which Jim would not admit even to himself for several more weeks, was that he had requested the assignment. He told himself it was because he already had a working relationship with the Japanese nurse. They had saved Fumiko Sato together on the train. There was established trust, professional rapport. It made practical sense. But lying alone in his barracks bunk at night, Jim knew the real reason. He wanted to understand her. This enemy who cried while eating bacon. This woman who looked at refrigerators like they were evidence of war crimes. He needed to know if his cracking worldview was justified or if he was just going soft. So on October 1st, 1944, Jim and Sachiko began working together in the Crystal City Hospital. The hospital occupied a converted recreation hall, its walls now lined with medical equipment that would have been extraordinary in most civilian facilities. An X-ray machine, modern surgical suite, pharmacy stocked with sulfa drugs and the new miracle medicine, penicillin, blood storage, refrigeration, sterilization equipment, everything a frontline military hospital would have right here in a prisoner internment camp. Sachiko stood in the middle of the main ward and felt her remaining defenses crumble. This prison camp hospital had better equipment than the military hospital in Hiroshima, where she had trained. Better than the field hospital in Saipan, where she had treated dying soldiers with nothing but bandages and prayer. The X-ray machine alone represented technology she had only read about in outdated medical textbooks. Dr. Chen appeared from her office, chart in hand, reading glasses perched on her nose. She looked up and smiled at Sachiko with genuine warmth. "Miss Tanaka, thank you for volunteering. We desperately need help with the Japanese patients. Many are frightened of American medical procedures. Having someone who speaks their language and understands their concerns will make treatment much easier." Through Private Watanabe's translation, Sachiko nodded. "I will help however I can, doctor." "Excellent. Let me show you what we are working with." The tour took 30 minutes. Each piece of equipment was a revelation. Each supply closet full of medicines was a condemnation. By the time they finished, Sachiko understood with brutal clarity just how far behind Japan had fallen. Dr. Chen showed her the pharmacy shelves stocked with medications Sachiko had never seen. "These are sulfonamide drugs," Dr. Chen explained, holding up a bottle of white pills. "They treat bacterial infections that would have been fatal just 10 years ago. We use them routinely now. Do you have these in Japan?" Sachiko shook her head, shame burning in her chest. "I have not heard this word sulfonamide." Dr. Chen's expression shifted. "Not pity exactly, but something close. What did you use to treat infections in your hospital?" "Traditional medicines, mostly. Herbs. If infection was very bad, sometimes we amputate to save life." The American doctor was quiet for a moment. "Then, Miss Tanaka, these drugs could have saved many of your patients. I am sorry you did not have access to them." The apology coming from an enemy doctor to an enemy nurse was almost unbearable. Jim, standing near the door maintaining his security presence, heard the exchange and felt something twist in his gut. He had known intellectually that Japan was behind technologically, but hearing it from Sachiko's own mouth, learning that Japanese military hospitals were operating like it was still the 19th century, that made it real. What kind of government sends its people to war without even basic medical supplies? The first patient arrived 10 minutes later. An elderly Japanese woman named Tomoko Watanabe, suffering from pneumonia. Her breathing was labored, her fever high, her cough wet and productive. In Japan, this would likely be a death sentence, especially for someone her age. Dr. Chen examined her, listened to her lungs through a stethoscope, and made her diagnosis quickly. "Bacterial pneumonia. We will start her on penicillin injections immediately. Miss Tanaka, please explain to her what we are going to do." Sachiko translated, speaking gently to the frightened woman. Tomoko gripped Sachiko's hand and asked in Japanese if the American doctor was going to hurt her. "No, grandmother," Sachiko said, using the respectful term for elders. "She is going to give you medicine, very strong medicine. It will help you breathe easier. Can I trust American medicine?" Sachiko looked at Dr. Chen preparing the injection at the vial of clear liquid that contained more medical advancement than anything available in Japan. "Yes," she said quietly, "you can trust it." Dr. Chen administered the penicillin. Within 6 hours, Tomoko's fever began to break. Within 24 hours, her breathing had eased significantly. Within 3 days, she was well enough to return to her cottage. It was a miracle, a routine, everyday American miracle that would have been impossible in Japan. Sachiko watched the recovery and felt her last defenses against the truth dissolve completely. She could no longer pretend this was American propaganda or strategic deception. This was simply superior medical science applied with competence and care to people who were supposed to be enemies. After the shift ended that first day, Jim walked Sachiko back to cottage 23 through the fading October light. They maintained professional distance several feet apart, but the silence between them felt less hostile than it had on the train. More contemplative. Halfway to her cottage, Jim stopped at a small building marked canteen. He gestured for Sachiko to wait, then emerged a minute later carrying 2 glass bottles of Coca-Cola condensation already forming on the cold glass. "Thirsty?" he asked. "It is hotter than hell today, even for October." Sachiko hesitated. Accepting gifts from her guard felt dangerous, like crossing a line she could not uncross. But the day had been long and hot, and the bottle looked impossibly cold in his hand. She nodded. Jim showed her how to use the bottle opener attached to the canteen wall. The cap came off with a metallic pop and a hiss of escaping carbonation. He handed her the open bottle and opened his own. "First Coke?" he asked. She nodded again, not trusting her English for more complex responses. Jim gestured to a bench in the shade of a mesquite tree. They sat still, maintaining proper distance, and Sachiko raised the bottle to her lips. The first sip was a shock to her system. Cold. So cold it almost hurt. Sweet. Sweeter than anything she had tasted in years. Fizzy, the carbonation tickling and burning her throat in a way that was almost painful but not quite. The flavor was complex, indefinable. Nothing like the tea or water she was accustomed to. She must have made a face because Jim chuckled. Takes some getting used to, but on a hot day, nothing beats it. Sachiko took another sip smaller this time, letting the strange beverage roll across her tongue. The sweetness was almost overwhelming. In Japan, sugar had been rationed since the war began. Candy was a memory from childhood. And here was a drink, a casual, everyday drink that was pure liquid sugar. We do not have this in Japan, she said carefully, her English halting but comprehensible. Really, Coke is everywhere here, even small towns. You can get it at any drugstore, at any diner. Sachiko processed this information. A luxury beverage available everywhere to everyone. While in Japan, sugar itself was precious beyond measure. They sat in silence for a moment, drinking their Coca-Colas, the late afternoon sun painting everything gold. Then Jim asked the question that had been building in him since the train ride. What did they tell you about Texas, about America? Sachiko was quiet for so long, Jim thought she might not answer. Then they told us Americans were poor, living in wooden houses, no electricity, little food, that your country was weak, divided. She paused, took another sip. That you would surrender quickly because Americans love comfort more than honor. Jim laughed, but there was no humor in it. Poor. Ma'am, my family are ranchers, not rich by American standards. Middle class, I guess. But we have had electricity since I was a boy. Running water, telephone, 3 meals a day, even during the Depression. Sachiko did the mental calculation. Electricity since he was a boy. He looked about 28. So that meant electricity in rural Texas since at least the early 1920s. Japan, even in cities, still had spotty electrical service in 1944. Your family had electricity in 1920s, she asked, needing to confirm. In the 30s, yeah, rural areas were slower to get it, but most of Texas was wired by then. The gap was even wider than she had thought. We were told lies, she said quietly, the admission costing her something vital. Yeah, Jim said. I figure your government could not tell you the truth. Nobody would have supported the war. Sachiko turned to look at him, really look at him. You were told lies too, about Japanese people. Jim nodded slowly. Oh yeah, we were told you were all fanatics, that you would never surrender, that you tortured prisoners, committed atrocities without remorse, that you were basically monsters in human form. And now Jim took a long drink of Coke, considering his words carefully. Now I am drinking soda with a Japanese nurse who cries when she eats bacon because it reminds her that her mother is starving. You do not seem like a monster to me. The honesty hung between them, naked and dangerous. As October turned to November, the relationship between Jim and Sachiko deepened in ways neither of them fully acknowledged. They were not friends exactly. The power imbalance was too great, the circumstances too strange. But they had become something more than guard and prisoner, something closer to colleagues. Maybe even allies in the shared project of making sense of a senseless war. Every morning, Jim escorted Sachiko to the hospital. Every afternoon, they worked together treating Japanese patients. Every evening, he walked her back to her cottage. And more often than not, they stopped at the canteen for Coca-Colas. The conversations grew longer, more honest, less guarded. Jim told her about his ranch in Texas, about raising cattle and repairing fences and watching storms roll across the plains. He told her about his father's death and his brothers fighting in Europe and his shame at not being in combat. Sachiko told him about Hiroshima, about her nursing education and her decision to volunteer and her family's pride in her service. She told him about the propaganda films and the patriotic songs and the certainty that Japan was destined to win because the emperor was divine. Do you still believe that, Jim asked one evening in late October? About the emperor being divine, Sachiko was quiet for a long time. Then divine beings do not lose wars. Divine beings do not let their people starve while feeding lies to their soldiers. So no, I do not believe anymore. The admission was heresy. In Japan, questioning the emperor's divinity was treason punishable by death. But here, sitting on a bench in Texas with an enemy soldier, Sachiko could finally speak the truth out loud. Jim understood what that confession cost her. What will you do when you go home? I do not know. Tell the truth, maybe. Try to help rebuild. Try to make sense of what I learned here. That is going to be hard. Being the one who knows uncomfortable truths. Yes, but lying is harder now. This place destroyed my ability to accept comfortable propaganda. Now I must live with truth, even when it hurts. In his letters to his brother Thomas, Jim tried to explain what was happening. Tom, she teaches me Japanese medical terms so I can help communicate with patients. I teach her more English so she can read the pharmaceutical labels. We work together like we are on the same team, which I guess we are now. Team keeps sick people alive. It is strange, brother. I came here wanting to hate them, wanting to make them pay for Pearl Harbor. for Johnny, for everything. But how do you hate someone who just wants to save lives? How do you hate someone who is as much a victim of this war as we are? I think maybe that is the real tragedy. Not that we are enemies, but that we were made into enemies by governments that lied to both of us. Then in the first week of December, something arrived that would make Sachiko's internal conflict infinitely worse. Red Cross mail delivery. The first communication from Japan in nearly 3 months. Sachiko received a letter from her mother. The envelope was thin, the paper inside written in shaky characters that looked nothing like her mother's usual precise handwriting. She read it alone in her cottage while the other women were at lunch, and with each line her heart broke a little more. My dear Sachiko, the letter began. We pray you are enduring terrible suffering with courage. The military officer told us American prisoners are tortured, starved, worked to death. We are proud you suffer for our divine emperor. Sachiko looked around the cottage, at the electric lights, the functioning refrigerator, the comfortable furniture. This was not suffering. This was living better than her family had ever lived. The letter continued. Conditions in Hiroshima worsened daily. Food rations cut again. Now 200 grams of rice per day mixed with sawdust to make it last. Father's factory was destroyed in November bombing. He survived but has no work now. We hear attacks will increase. Sachiko's hands began to shake. Grandmother died last month. Malnutrition and cold. We could not afford fuel to heat the house. She died in her sleep, which the doctor said was a mercy. The words blurred as tears filled Sachiko's eyes. Her grandmother, the woman who had taught her to read, who had told her stories of old Japan, who had saved rice from her own meager portions to help Sachiko through nursing school. Dead, while Sachiko gained weight eating American food. I boiled acorns yesterday to make soup, her mother wrote. Very bitter but fills the stomach. Neighbor was arrested for complaining about food shortage. Taken away. We do not know where. Be strong, my daughter. Your suffering has meaning. We endure together in spirit. Your devoted mother. Sachiko read the letter 3 times. Then she looked at the lunch tray someone had left for her on the kitchen table. Chicken breast, mashed potatoes, green beans, bread, milk. Her grandmother had died eating acorns. She was gaining weight eating chicken. She went to the bathroom and vomited. Not from sickness, from shame so profound it felt physical. That evening, Jim found her sitting outside her cottage, the letter clutched in her hand, her eyes red from crying. He did not ask permission. He just sat down beside her on the porch step. Bad news from home. Sachiko handed him the letter silently. Jim read it, his face going pale. When he finished, he folded it carefully and handed it back. Your grandmother. Christ, I am so sorry. She died eating acorns. Sachiko said, her voice flat. I ate 6 pieces of bacon this morning. Sachiko, that is not your fault. Then whose fault is it? I am alive, well-fed, safe while my family dies. How is that not my fault? It is your government's fault for starting a war they could not win, for lying to their people, for choosing conquest over caring for their citizens. My mother believes I am being tortured. She needs to believe that. It gives meaning to their suffering. If she knew the truth that I live better as prisoner than she lives as free citizen, it would destroy her. Jim had no response because Sachiko was right. Sometimes the truth was more cruel than lies. They sat in silence as darkness fell and the streetlights came on, automatically powered by the endless American electricity that mocked every privation Sachiko's family endured. When the war ends, Jim finally said, you can show them. You can prove that surviving is not shameful, that accepting help is not weakness, that there is another way to live. You think I can change Japan? I think you have already changed. And when you go home, you will be someone who knows the truth. That has to count for something. Sachiko wanted to believe him, but sitting there with her mother's letter describing death by acorn soup while she digested American chicken belief seemed impossible. The next day at the hospital, Sachiko worked with renewed intensity, as if saving Japanese patients with American medicine could somehow atone for the guilt eating her alive. She learned the English names for every drug in the pharmacy. She memorized dosages and treatment protocols. She translated medical instructions with painstaking care. Dr. Chen noticed the change. Miss Tanaka, you are working too hard. You need rest. Work is better than thinking, Sachiko replied. The doctor studied her with knowing eyes. You got news from home. It was not a question. Sachiko nodded, unable to speak. Dr. Chen put a hand on her shoulder. I cannot imagine how difficult this is for you, but you are doing good work here. You have saved lives. That matters. Does it? Sachiko asked. Does saving lives here matter when my family dies there? Yes, Dr. Chen said firmly. Every life matters. Japanese or American, prisoner or free. You are a nurse. You know this. And somehow hearing it from another woman, another doctor, another person who understood the weight of medical responsibility, Sachiko felt a small measure of comfort. By mid-December, the tension in the camp was rising. Major Bradford had announced plans for a Christmas celebration, gifts for children, a feast, decorations and music, a communal gathering of all internees regardless of nationality. But the announcement created division among the Japanese internees. A faction of older women led by a hardline former government official named Keiko Matsuda saw the Christmas celebration as an attempt to destroy Japanese culture, to force assimilation, to break their spirits through kindness. One evening, Keiko called a meeting. 20 women attended. Sachiko went curious about what resistance might look like in a place where there were no bars to rattle, no chains to break. Keiko stood at the front of a crowded living room and spoke with authority. This Christmas celebration is propaganda, she declared in Japanese. They fatten us like livestock. They give us comfort in food and gifts. They want us to forget we are Japanese, to betray our culture, to abandon our emperor. We must refuse. We must maintain our dignity through resistance. Several women nodded. The appeal to dignity to cultural preservation was powerful, but Sachiko, standing near the back, raised her hand. Matsuda-san, with respect, is accepting a gift truly betrayal? Is learning about American customs abandoning our identity? Keiko's eyes narrowed. You have been corrupted, Tanaka, working with that American guard, eating their food, using their medicine. You have forgotten what it means to be Japanese. I have not forgotten, but I have learned what it means to survive. These Americans treat us better than our own government did. Perhaps instead of rejecting their kindness out of pride, we should learn from it. Traitor Keiko spat. You shame Japan with your weakness. Other women began to argue. The room split. Voices rose. Some sided with Keiko's hardline resistance. Others, particularly the younger women who had been working in the hospital or the schools, sided with Sachiko's pragmatism. The division was complete. Jim, standing outside the cottage, maintaining security, could not understand the Japanese words, but he could read the anger in the voices, the sharp gestures, the way women began to cluster into opposing groups. When Sachiko emerged, her face was tight with stress. Problem, Jim asked. Division, Sachiko said. Some women cannot accept kindness. They think it is trick. Or worse, they know it is real and cannot accept what that means about Japan. That is denial. Human nature. Yes, but also cultural. In Japan, admitting you were wrong is very difficult, especially for someone like Matsuda, who worked for government that created lies. To admit America was right means admitting her whole life was wrong. Jim nodded slowly. He understood that kind of psychological self-protection. He had been doing it himself for weeks, trying not to admit that these Japanese women were decent people, caught in circumstances beyond their control. That night, Reiko found Sachiko sitting outside the cottage, staring at the stars. The sky was clear, cold, infinite. The same stars that hung over Hiroshima. The same moon that lit her family's darkened home. You care for him, Reiko said quietly, sitting down beside her. Sachiko did not deny it. How could she? The truth was written in every conversation, every shared Coca-Cola, every moment of understanding that passed between them. I know, Sachiko said. That is dangerous. I know that too. He is the enemy. Is he? Sachiko turned to look at her friend. He saved Fumiko's life on the train. He treats us with kindness. What part of that is enemy behavior? Reiko had no answer, because she was struggling with the same contradictions. They all were. How do you hate people who feed you? How do you maintain your anger against a nation that treats its prisoners better than your own nation treats its citizens? What will you do about the Christmas feast? Reiko asked finally. Sachiko was quiet for a long time. Then I think I will go. I think I will eat their turkey and accept their kindness and carry my guilt. Because the alternative is to starve myself like Matsuda wants, and that helps no one. Reiko nodded. I will go too. And so will Yuki. Hana is still deciding. They sat together in comfortable silence, two women trying to navigate an impossible situation, trying to find meaning in circumstances that defied easy answers. December 25th, 1944 began with silence. Not the peaceful silence of Christmas morning in a world at peace, but the heavy, expectant silence of a decision about to be made. Sachiko woke before dawn, her heart pounding, her stomach churning with anxiety that had nothing to do with hunger and everything to do with fear. Today was the day she would betray her country or save her soul, depending on how you looked at it. She lay in bed listening to Reiko's breathing from the other side of the room, watching the darkness slowly give way to gray dawn light through the window. The cottage was warm. The electric heater hummed steadily, pushing hot air through vents that would have been impossible luxury in Japan. Even the simple act of being warm on Christmas morning felt like evidence against her. Evidence of comfort accepted. Evidence of enemy kindness embraced. Evidence of treason. At 6 o'clock, Reiko stirred and sat up. She looked across the room and saw Sachiko already awake, staring at the ceiling. You did not sleep, Reiko said. No. Are you going? The question hung in the air like smoke. Sachiko had told no one of her decision, had kept it locked inside as if speaking it aloud would make it too real, too permanent, too much like the betrayal Keiko said it was. Yes, Sachiko said finally. I am going. Reiko nodded slowly. Good. I am going too, and so is Yuki. Hana decided last night she will come as well. All four of us then. All four of us. There was a knock at the door. When Yuki answered, it was a young woman named Ichiko, barely 20 years old. She had been one of Keiko's followers initially, but something had changed in the past week. She stood at the threshold, determination in her face that bordered on fierceness. I am going to the feast, Michiko announced, and I am going to eat everything they put on my plate. And if anyone tries to stop me or shame me or call me traitor, I will tell them exactly where they can put their opinions about honor and loyalty. Sachiko felt something like pride warm her chest. 3 months ago, this woman had been wavering between resistance and acceptance. Now she was claiming her right to survive, refusing to be ashamed of choosing life over death. We are all going, Sachiko said. All 5 of us, together. The 5 women got dressed carefully, not in the prison uniforms they had arrived in, but in the simple dresses that had been provided by the camp. Cotton dresses, nothing fancy, but clean and whole and suitable for a Christmas celebration. Sachiko looked at herself in the bathroom mirror and barely recognized the woman staring back. 3 months ago, she had been 98 pounds of bone and hunger and certainty. Now she was 115 pounds. Her cheeks had filled out. Her skin had color. Her eyes were clear instead of hollowed by starvation. She looked healthy. She looked alive. She looked like a traitor. At 8:30, the 5 women left cottage 23 and walked toward the dining hall. Other Japanese women were emerging from other cottages, some walking with purpose, others hesitating, looking around nervously as if expecting to be caught committing a crime. And perhaps they were. The crime of choosing survival. The crime of accepting kindness. The crime of being human instead of fanatic. As they walked, they passed cottage 17. Keiko stood on the porch with several other women watching the procession with cold eyes. When she saw Sachiko, she stepped forward. Tanaka Keiko called out, You shame your family. You shame Japan. You shame the emperor himself. Sachiko stopped walking. The other 4 women stopped with her. For a moment, Sachiko considered ignoring Keiko walking past, refusing to engage. But something rose up in her, some anger that had been building for weeks, some fury at the hypocrisy and the manipulation and the waste. My family is starving, Sachiko said, her voice carrying in the cold morning air. My grandmother died eating acorns. My mother boils tree bark for soup. And you stand there well-fed enough to survive, telling me I should feel shame for accepting food that keeps me alive to help other people. She took a step toward Keiko. You know what shames Japan? Not me eating turkey. Our government starting a war we could not win. Our leaders lying to us about American weakness. Our military sending men to die without medicine or supplies or hope. That is what shames Japan. Not prisoners choosing to live. Keiko's face flushed with anger. You have been corrupted by the Americans. By that guard you spend so much time with. You forget what it means to be Japanese. No, Sachiko said quietly. I remember what it means to be human. Maybe you should try that instead. She turned and continued walking toward the dining hall. Behind her, she heard Keiko shouting something about traitors and dishonor and divine punishment. But Sachiko did not turn back, did not engage further, because Keiko's words had no power anymore. Keiko's version of loyalty was just another lie, another manipulation, another way of controlling people through shame. And Sachiko was done with lies. The dining hall was already filling when they arrived. German families sat at long tables, children excited about the presents waiting under the massive Christmas tree. Italian internees chatted with the American staff, comparing notes on traditional holiday foods. And slowly, in groups of 2 and 3 and 4 Japanese women entered, some boldly, some timidly, all of them carrying the weight of their choice. Jim stood near the entrance, officially on duty, unofficially watching for Sachiko. When he saw her come in, when their eyes met across the crowded room, the relief on his face was unmistakable. He had hoped she would come, had believed she would come, but had not been certain until this moment. Sachiko gave him a small nod, an acknowledgement, a thank you for believing in her when she barely believed in herself. Major Bradford stood at the front of the hall and called for attention. The room gradually quieted, children shushing conversations trailing off until everyone was looking at the camp commander. Ladies and gentlemen, Bradford began, families, Friends, today we celebrate Christmas. For many of you, this is a sacred holiday. For others, it may be unfamiliar. But I hope that today, regardless of our backgrounds or beliefs, we can share a meal together as human beings. As people who, despite the circumstances that brought us here, can find common ground in breaking bread together. He paused, letting his words settle. This war will end someday. When it does, I hope the memories you take from Crystal City are not of bars and guards and confinement. I hope you remember moments like this, when we chose to be kind to each other, when we chose to see our shared humanity instead of our differences. There was scattered applause, some enthusiastic, some polite, some uncertain. But it was applause. Now Bradford continued with a smile. Let us eat. The feast began. Volunteers and staff moved through the hall, placing platters on tables. Turkey golden and glistening, carved into thick slices. Stuffing rich with herbs and butter. Mashed potatoes in mountains. Gravy flowing like rivers. Cranberry sauce bright as blood. Green beans. Dinner rolls still warm from the oven. And for dessert, visible on a separate table, pies. Pumpkin and apple and pecan, their crusts perfect, their smells intoxicating. Sachiko sat with her group at a table near the windows. As the food was placed before them, as the abundance manifested in real and immediate form, she felt her breathing become shallow. This was it, the moment of final surrender, the moment when she would eat enemy food in celebration of an enemy holiday while her family suffered and died. Reiko reached under the table and gripped Sachiko's hand. We do this together, she whispered. We survive together. Sachiko nodded, unable to speak. The turkey was placed on her plate. 3 thick slices, dark meat and white still steaming. A scoop of stuffing beside it. Mashed potatoes drowning in gravy. Green beans with slivered almonds. A dinner roll with a pat of butter already melting on top. This single plate contained more food than Sachiko's entire family would eat in a week. More calories, more protein, more nutrition, more everything. Around her, people began to eat. The Germans and Italians without hesitation, accustomed now to American abundance. The Japanese women more slowly, each bite a small act of courage or betrayal depending on your perspective. Sachiko picked up her fork. Her hand trembled. She cut a small piece of turkey, speared it, lifted it to her mouth. The smell hit her first. Roasted meat, seasoned and perfect. Then the taste, salt and sage and richness that exploded across her tongue. The texture, tender, juicy, nothing like the dried fish or watery rice that had been her diet for years. She chewed. She swallowed. And the tears came. Not delicate tears. Not polite tears. Great racking sobs that shook her whole body. She put down her fork and covered her face with her hands and cried like her heart was breaking. Because it was. Breaking and reforming. Breaking and reforming with each breath. Reiko put an arm around her shoulders. Yuki gripped her other hand. Michiko, sitting across the table, was crying too. They were all crying. Every Japanese woman in that hall who had chosen to come, who had chosen to eat, who had chosen to survive, they were crying. Jim watched from his post near the entrance and felt his own eyes burn with tears he could not shed. Not here, not on duty, but inside something in him was breaking too. Breaking with the understanding of what this meal cost these women, what this kindness cost, what this mercy required them to sacrifice. After several minutes, Sachiko got control of herself. She wiped her eyes, took a shaky breath, and picked up her fork again. And she continued eating, methodically, deliberately, forcing herself to taste every bite, to acknowledge every flavor, to bear full witness to this impossible gift of food while her family starved. This is my war crime, she thought. Not killing, not torture, not atrocity, just this. Eating turkey while my mother eats tree bark. Surviving while my family dies. Being shown mercy I can never repay, and kindness I can never deserve. When she had finished everything on her plate, when she had consumed every last morsel, Sachiko sat back and looked around the dining hall. German children were laughing, playing with toys from under the tree. Italian families were singing carols in their native language. American staff were moving through the room, refilling drinks, offering seconds, smiling and joking like this was a normal Christmas dinner instead of a feast in a prison camp. And Japanese women were eating, some still crying, some stone-faced, some almost smiling as if they had given themselves permission to enjoy this one meal, this one moment of peace in a world at war. Dessert was brought out. Sachiko accepted a slice of pumpkin pie, though she was already uncomfortably full. The pie was sweet spiced with cinnamon and nutmeg, topped with whipped cream that was pure decadence. She ate it slowly, making each bite last, storing the memory of this taste for whatever came next. After the meal, Major Bradford invited everyone to gather around the Christmas tree for presents. The children went first, squealing with delight over simple toys, books, dolls, wooden trains. Then the adults. Each internee, regardless of nationality, received a small package. Basic items mostly. Soap, toothbrushes, writing paper. But wrapped in brown paper and tied with string, given with care, received with gratitude. When Sachiko opened her package, she found a notebook, blank pages ready to be filled, and a note handwritten from Dr. Chen. For your memories, it said, so you can tell them the truth when you go home. Sachiko clutched the notebook to her chest and felt fresh tears come, because Dr. Chen understood. Understood that Sachiko was trying to be a witness. Understood that documentation mattered. Understood that someone needed to remember and record what had happened here. As the celebration continued, Jim found a moment to approach Sachiko's table. He did not sit, that would be too familiar, but he stood close enough to speak quietly. Your family would not want you dead, he said. That is not honor. That is waste. Sachiko looked up at him, this American soldier who had somehow become the person who understood her best. I know, she said, but knowing and believing are different things. Then believe this, Jim said. You are doing good work at the hospital. You are saving lives. You are helping people. That matters. That is worth being alive for. Even if my own family dies while I save strangers, especially then. Because if you die too, then nobody benefits. Your family still suffers. Your patients lose their nurse. And the world loses one more person who knows the truth and might tell it someday. Sachiko was quiet for a moment. Then she said something she had been thinking, but had not dared to speak aloud. I care for you, James Coleman. More than I should. More than is wise. Jim's breath caught. He had known somewhere deep down that something was happening between them. Something that went beyond guard and prisoner, beyond duty and protocol, beyond anything that made sense in a world at war. But hearing her say it, hearing the words spoken in her careful English, made it real in a way that was both terrifying and beautiful. I know, he said quietly. I feel the same, and I do not know what to do about it either. They looked at each other across the impossible divide of nationality and circumstance and war. And in that look, they acknowledged a truth that could never be acted upon, could never be consummated, could never be anything more than this. Two people who cared for each other in a world that would never allow them to be together. When you go home, Jim said, when the war ends, the Coleman Ranch is in the public records. You could find it if you wanted. I could. Sachiko agreed, but I do not know if I could explain what it was like. To return to Japan knowing what I know. Seeing what I have seen. You could try. Maybe I will. The moment stretched between them, fragile and precious. Then Jim straightened, professional distance reasserting itself. Merry Christmas, Miss Tanaka. Merry Christmas, Sergeant Coleman. He walked away, back to his post, back to his duty. And Sachiko watched him go, feeling the weight of all the things that could never be, all the possibilities foreclosed by circumstance, all the love that would remain forever unspoken and unacted upon. That evening, back in Cottage 23, Sachiko sat at the small kitchen table with the new notebook Dr. Chen had given her. She opened it to the first blank page, picked up a pen, and began to write. She wrote in English, this time not Japanese, because this account was not for her family or for Japan. This was for the future. For whoever might someday want to know what really happened here, what it felt like to be shown mercy by an enemy, what it cost to survive when survival meant betrayal. December 25th, 1944, she wrote, Today I ate turkey while my mother ate tree bark. Today I celebrated Christmas while my grandmother lay dead in Hiroshima. Today I chose survival over loyalty, truth over lies, and I do not know if I can ever forgive myself. She wrote about the bacon breakfast that first morning in Crystal City, about the cottage with electricity and running water, about Dr. Chen and the penicillin and the miracle of modern medicine, about Jim Coleman and his father's words about mercy, about Keiko and her faction and the cruelty of calling survival betrayal. She wrote about the guilt and the gratitude, the shame and the hope, the impossible weight of being the one who knew too much to believe comfortable lies anymore. She wrote until her hand cramped, until the words ran out, until exhaustion finally pulled at her. And then she closed the notebook and sat in the quiet cottage, listening to her roommates breathing in sleep. Her war was over, not the global war. That would rage on for 8 more months, would kill hundreds of thousands more, would end with atomic fire over cities she had grown up near, would transform Japan from empire to occupied nation. But her personal war, her ability to see Americans as monsters and Japan as righteous, that war was over. It had ended not with a bang, but with kindness. Not with defeat on a battlefield, but with turkey in a dining hall. Not with surrender signed on a battleship, but with mercy accepted in a prison camp in Texas. In the months that followed, Sachiko would continue working at the hospital, would continue learning English and saving lives and bearing witness, would continue her quiet friendship with Jim Coleman that walked the knife edge of propriety, would continue writing in her notebook, documenting everything, storing up truth for whatever battles lay ahead. In August of 1945, news would reach Crystal City that atomic bombs had been dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, that Japan had surrendered unconditionally, that the war was over. Sachiko would learn that her mother had survived. Her father had survived, but their home was gone, destroyed in the blast. Hiroshima was gone, transformed from city to ash in a single moment of white light and heat, and Sachiko would be repatriated, sent home to a Japan she no longer recognized, a Japan of ruins and starvation and shame, a Japan that would look at her with suspicion because she had been captured instead of dying, because she had accepted enemy kindness, because she had survived. She would try to tell them the truth, would try to explain what she had seen, the abundance, the technology, the kindness, would try to make them understand that the war had been lost before it began. Most would not believe her, would call her corrupted, would say the prison camp had broken her spirit, would reject her truth because accepting it would mean accepting that everything they had suffered had been for nothing. But some would listen, a few doctors, some nurses, young people who had survived and wanted to understand why. And slowly, painfully, Japan would begin to rebuild, not on the lies of the past, but on the hard truth of the present. And Sachiko Tanaka would be one of the voices telling that truth, not loudly, not proudly, but persistently, bearing witness to what she had seen, to the devastating kindness of an enemy who had refused to be monstrous. She would never see Jim Coleman again, never write the letter she sometimes thought about writing, never try to explain to him what his kindness had cost her, what his mercy had required her to sacrifice. But she would think of him, often, would remember the way he caught her on the gangplank at Oakland, the way he worked beside her to save Fumiko Sato, the way he looked at her on Christmas Day and told her that her family would not want her dead. She would remember all of it, the bacon and the cottages and the hospital and the Coca-Colas and the Christmas feast, would carry those memories not as shame but as proof. Proof that even in the depths of war, truth can break through. The truth can win. And as Sachiko sat in her cottage on Christmas night, 1944, closing her notebook and preparing for sleep, she understood something fundamental. She had stopped fighting a war that could not be won. She had chosen to live when dying would have been easier. She had seen behind the curtain and found not monsters, but people trying to survive. Outside, the Texas stars shone bright and cold over Crystal City, over cottages with electric lights, over a hospital with medicine, over a dining hall where enemies had shared a feast, over all the contradictions of this place where war and peace, hatred and kindness existed side by side. And in Cottage 23, Sachiko Tanaka slept, dreaming of a future where she could tell this story, where someone would listen, where the truth she had learned might matter, where mercy and kindness might be remembered not as weakness, but as the strongest weapon of all. The weapon that had won her war 8 months before the empire surrendered, and the world learned what she had discovered in Texas, that the enemy is not always who you think, that cruelty is often built on lies, and that the most devastating truth is simple and terrible and beautiful all at once. We are all just people, and people deserve to survive, even when they are supposed to be enemies, especially then.